Okay, it's all yours.
Excellent. Well, yes, thank you so much for letting me speak today. So I want to talk about how ecological changes are depicted in Alexander von Humboldt's and Charles Darwin's travel writing. And I'm particularly focusing on two chapters from their respective works. So to give you a bit of background to this presentation, I first want to clarify what my doctoral research is about. So I analyzed the travel writing of Alexander von Humboldt, Charles Darwin, but also Ernst Haeckel, who traveled and wrote throughout the 19th century. And, oh, it's not really coming out. Okay, well, the slide's a little bit messed up on Microsoft Teams. Sorry about that. Well, I'm mainly concerned with how scientific travel writing encourages an understanding of natural environments and man's place in it. And in this way, I'm investigating the historicity of environmental writing. So I typically sort of investigate common travel writing motifs, such as the interplay between narrator and traveler, time and space, and drama and description. And here specifically, this comes to light as the interplay between scientific description and the traveler's encounters and experiences. So the focus of this presentation is really looking at the ways in which the travel writing motif of movement encourages an understanding of ecological systems which are in change. And emphasizing change as is very much an important ingredient in modern ecology, as opposed to previous ideas that are visible, say, in the more romantic notions of a harmony in nature, or even Carlos Linnaeus's first idea of an economy of nature, which was orderly structured by God. So the first coinage and definition of ecology, which was by Ernst Haeckel, did actually not emphasize neither harmony or a certain structure. He wrote that the ecology is the whole science of relations of the organism to the environment, including, in the broad sense, all the conditions of existence. And these are of the greatest significance for the form of organisms, for they force them to become adapted. And I guess we can recognize sort of a few words in this definition, because Haeckel drew on the words and ideas of previous naturalists, of course, such as Alexander von Humboldt, and I think in particular Charles Darwin. And I really want to just quickly touch on that. So Humboldt and Darwin could both be said to have advanced types of ecologies avant la lettre. So Humboldt's system of biogeography proved a different method of characterizing organisms to the taxonomy of Linnaeus by instead highlighting the interrelatedness of organisms to their physical environment and climate. So he provided a way to describe the physical living conditions of organisms. And so to him, it followed that if one element in these relations were changed, other elements that were dependent on it would also follow. And in chapter 16 of Humboldt's personal narrative, so his travel writing, the narrator muses on a regional climate change and the falling water levels of the Lake Tagarigua. And today that's Lake Valencia in Venezuela. And he gathers that it is due to the burning and felling of trees and the heavy agriculture in the region, basically changing the entire ecological system of the place. And Darwin also very much laid much of the groundwork for the formation of modern ecological studies. So with his theory of evolution, he basically traced and mapped the changes to species in their very own course of history. So one might say he destabilized the stable structure of the Linnaean taxonomic system itself. And the evolutionary changes to organisms he discovered were conditioned by the adaptation to their environment, resulting either in their proliferation, change in their habit of form, or their extinction. And this fact really revealed that the surroundings in which the transformed organism lived and acted within could also change. So in one of his most famous chapters from the Voyage of the Beagle, you might be familiar with it, it's called the Galápagos Archipelago. The author traces previously immigrated species to understand those he has found and described on the islands on his journey. And those who have traveled along with human colonizers lead him to sort of a speculation of the extinction of the indigenous island species. So let's just really quickly think back on Haeckel's definition that states that one must understand an organism's conditions of existence to understand its change. So for understanding ecological changes observed in environments by Humboldt and Darwin, some notion of a previous environmental structure and system must be present. And that's what I want to touch upon now. So to show an ecological change, the author first constructs an environmental image of the past, so to say, that is then deconstructed in their discoveries of ecological change while traveling. So the two naturalist authors do this through a geographical segregation and identification of the environment's physical conditions. So this segregation takes form on a structural, but also on a content level. So both authors define distinct areas either via chapter titles or creating boundaries to other places. So Humboldt's chapter 16, as we know, is about the Lake Tagarigua, creates an image of distinctiveness from the very beginning of the chapter. So in the first paragraph of the chapter, he writes of the lake's valleys that, and I quote here from the slide, on the north, they are separated by the Sierra Mariara from the seacoast, and toward the south, the chain of Guaquima and Yusma serves them as a rampart against the heated air of the steppes. Groups of hills high enough to determine the course of the waters close this basin on the east and west like transverse dikes. So we find these hills between the Tuy and La Victoria, as well as on the road from Valencia to Nierua and at the mountains of Chorito. From this extraordinary configuration of the land, the little rivers of the valleys of Aragua form a peculiar system and direct their course towards a basin that's closed on all sides. So here the mountain borders seem to sort of determine the entire environmental system within it. The water is gathering in the basin and is not directed to the ocean, which is the common thing to do. And as we'll actually come to know, the water is only checked by the extensive evaporation from tropical heat of the climate around it. So this makes the conditions within the mountainous borders very, very fertile, as opposed to the barren neighboring regions around it. And this is all very much in line with Humboldt's biogeographical method of distinguishing between sort of a comprehensive glance of nature in its climate zone and then the local natural phenomena observable. And although the Aragua Valleys do not adhere to their larger climate zone, the systematization and distinction of what makes up the physical forces of that environment is still made. Okay, so it is very possible that Charles Darwin was inspired by Humboldt's way of distinguishing environmental areas from each other. So as many critics have noted, Darwin had read and reread Humboldt as his travel narrative, both before, during, and after his journey on board the Beagle. And many critics have looked at this sort of in an aesthetic manner, but we will try to now to discuss what relevance this has to the ecological depiction. So like Humboldt, Darwin tried to enclose areas through chapters and border drawings. And in his chapter on the Galápagos, he even expands upon this by including a visual element in the first paragraphs. And this was a map of the archipelago. And what's quite ironic, perhaps, is that this wood carving is frameless or borderless because its surroundings are almost these boundless stretches of ocean. So instead, the narrative quite literally, but also in a metaphoric sense, frames the archipelago in the text. And like Humboldt, Darwin describes the area's geographical, geological, and climatic condition. So being near the equator and 600 miles westward of the coast of America, Darwin, he gathers that the volcanic islands were all formed in the oceans, and I quote here, that their singular uniformity in the broken state of craters are explained by the waves of the trade wind and the swell from the open Pacific here uniting their forces on the southern coast of all the islands. So these heterogeneous conditions from opposing environments built an independent world shaped by its surrounding environmental elements. And in fact, Darwin will later come up with a metaphor, a satellite, to describe the sort of singularity of the island group, but also the archipelago's main connection to South America. So like in Humboldt's portrayal, despite being right near equator, the climatic conditions of the archipelago diverge very locally. And these conditions, as well as the volcanic ground, reveals that, and as I hear from the slide, the lower parts of the lands are very sterile. The upper parts, at a height of 1,000 feet and upwards, possess a damp climate and a tolerably luxuriant vegetation. So this diversity of the island satellite or island group satellite can really host a manifold of new species to uncover and compare to others across the world, which will be quite important. Good. So both authors really define a singular environmental system by distinguishing it from its surrounding environments. Now, I will try to show how travel movement within these borders help make understand important elements of the ecological systems that are depicted. So here I have tried to reveal the places and sequences of visits within the lake area that Humboldt went to. And the chapter's first recorded visit is to an island in the lake from where Humboldt can have this great overview of the entire region. And what is very interesting is that it is from here that he also makes his chapter hypothesis on why the water levels of the lake drop. So the rest of his visits in the area are basically used to confirm and further develop this hypothesis. So this includes visiting nearby towns, farms, connected rivers and hot springs, and even road passages that are leading goods to the valleys to the Atlantic coast. So what basically happens here is that the traveler crisscrosses the region and anchors the information to the center point of the chapter, which is both geographically and in his scientific argument. And I think this is like an essay-like style that's very familiar to most scientific papers, really. But here it's with the addition of actual movement in narrative sequences. And I don't think it's very uncommon, because in Western narratology, movement and sort of taking steps to increase knowledge is very commonly interlinked. So we see here really an effective method of communicating a scientific hypothesis, while the reader, in a very engaging manner, is presented sort of hands-on evidence through Humboldt's journey. And Humboldt's encounters sort of on the move within the confined region both show the function of the ecological system of the Lake Tagarigua and also the ecological changes which have happened and are still happening to it. So, for example, Humboldt visits the hot springs of La Trinchera, which, despite releasing a sulfurized gas and having a boiling hot temperature, makes its surroundings incredibly fertile, because the strong water evaporation causes the plants to spring forth right around it. And this water evaporation effect is the same as that of the entire Tagarigua Lake's effect of fertility, which is given to the entire region or the entire environment. And this small encounter then of the journey becomes a metaphor for the ecological systems within that environment. But the singular encounters are also very much metaphors of the ecological change that are happening to the region. So I just want to read a passage out loud from the chapter where Humboldt moves from one fertile area of the valleys to a very sterile one around the old city of Nueva Valencia. So he writes, "We passed a little forest of palm trees, which resembles by their appearance and their leaves spread like a fan the Chamarup's humilies of the coast of Barbary. The trunk, however, rises to 24 and sometimes 30 feet high. It is probably a new species of the genus Coryph and is called in the country Palma di Sombrero, the footstalks of the leaves being employed in weaving hats that resemble our straw hats. This grove of palm trees, the withered foliage of which rustles at the least breath of air, the camels that feed in the plain, the undulating motion of the vapors on a soil burned by the ardor of the sun, give the landscape an African aspect. The aridity of the land augments as the traveler approaches the town after passing the western extremity of the lake. It is a clay soil that has been leveled and abandoned by the waters. So like a hat, this palm tree brings shade to people as it has done to the soil in the area. And later in the very same paragraph, Humboldt comments that, and I quote here, if using plants and forage which shade the soil by their large leaves, the amelioration of the fields would be gradually accomplished and they would be restored to a part of their former fertility. So the sombrero palm tree here is at once a metaphoric but also an empiric example of what ecological element is missing in this smaller area around Nueva Valencia. And it also reveals why the felling of these trees lead to the falling water levels of the lake. So in this way, Humboldt's sequential travel movement basically interlinks smaller phenomena and ecological changes to the issues at stake in the greater environment. So Darwin has taken what seems to be a less integrative path, infusing sequential narrative and scientific description. So his chapter on the Galápagos Isles of his second edition of the travel narrative are separated into sections with visible gaps between the texts. So the first section frames the archipelago and then traces Darwin's journey among the separate islands. And the second section is a natural historical account of the plant life and the zoological inhabitants of the islands, which he realizes diverge slightly on each island. And the last section is a type of hypothetical reflection of the future of organisms of the islands in which Darwin finally warns of their extinction. And I think the section breaks could indicate an increased divide between drama and description, movement and image, and well, ultimately of science and literature. But as I will also try and argue here, the gaps prove quite beneficial in understanding the reasons for organic divergences and changes on the islands. So Darwin, he does not narrate his actual movement from island to island. Like the section breaks, there are basically narrated gaps between each visit to each island. And these allow him to move quite effortlessly from the greater characterization of the greater archipelagic environment and to what makes out the individual islands. So when he's landing on Chatham Island in the beginning, he discovers that the islands were, to his surprise, in bloom. And later in the chapter, he will come to write, and I quote, he was astonished at the amount of creative force, if such an expression may be used, displayed on these small, barren and rocky islands. So the reader will really only uncover this creative force of diversity on the islands if she travels with the naturalist, uncovering their potential to host species that are unique to them. So for example, Darwin is himself hosted in a friendlier damp climate by other human settlers on James Island, and who offer him shelter. And it really turns out that this particular climate and this singular island also hosts a new species of water birds that are not able to live on the sterile coast of the very same island. So in this way, the singular environments visited within the greater archipelagic regions are weaved together and made graspable by the traveler's movement and own accommodation within the very same environment. So you could say Darwin's traveled past emphasizes the image of diversity of the island environments, which will really allow him to explain the change that organisms have undergone to look and behave as they do in the present. So the visual section breaks of the chapter, they also mark an unformulated transition in time. So we have a narration of past traveling. Then we have a description of the natural history of organisms that's written up in the present tense. And then lastly, a type of reflection of what is to come. So the three sections are marked in the past, in the present, and in the future tense, respectively. And the middle part resembles Humboldt's chapter of Lake Tacarigua in that it basically makes essay-like excursions to past encounters made while on the move. And these are quite lively, so I'll just give you an example. Darwin, he writes an anthropomorphized account of a terrestrial lizard's habits. So he writes, "This animal, when making its burrow, works alternately the opposite sides of its body. One front leg for a short time scratches up the soil and throws it towards the hind foot, which is well placed so as to heave it beyond the mouth of the hole. That side of the body being tired, the other takes up the task, and so on alternately. I watched one for a long time till half of its body was buried. I then walked up and pulled it by the tail. At this it was greatly astonished, and soon shuffled up to see what was the matter, and then stared me in the face as much as to say, 'What made you pull my tail?'" So critics that are familiar with Darwin, they would see this as an example of Darwin's many ways of conveying the habits of animals in his works. And I think it also very much rings a bell for those that are familiar with his work, the expression of emotions in man and animals. But what less people might realize here is that the lizard's reaction is quite crucial for understanding the island's animal ecology at present and in the future. Because this stupefied reaction of the lizard really reveals first the island environment, which is currently without large predators. So it's thus a metaphor and also a confirmation of the confinement of the singular islands and the greater archipelago. But this tameness will really also prove quite fatal when other species migrate to the archipelago, and especially when it is increased to the globalized extent that the human species were initiating in the 19th century. Yet, this is merely symptomatic of island environments of the past. So, like Humboldt, other journey encounters really convey by whose acts ecological changes can happen within the archipelago. And the very first creature that Darwin describes on the island, which is a mouse that at first appears to be indigenous, is later rationalized to belong to a division of an American family of mice. And Darwin rationalizes this by actually comparing it to an old world division of a rat on James Island, which we have previously come to know was habituated by Spanish settlers. So Darwin writes, "Although no one has a right to speculate without distinct facts, it should be borne in mind that it may possibly be an American species imported here. For I have seen in a most unfrequented part of the Pampas a native mouse living in the roof of a newly built hove, and therefore its transportation in a vessel is not improbable. Analogous facts have been observed by Dr. Richardson in North America." So Darwin compares the mouse's habits of another species separated on another confined island, but which possesses similar habitual traits. And through that, Darwin can ascertain that the mouse has migrated to the Galápagos from America and hence not in its history endemic to the island's ecological structure. And this would really only have been made possible by humans such as the Spanish settlers, or even himself, traveling to the Isles via vessels from South America and taking up accommodation in the same environments as the mice. So many ecological changes can ultimately be traced back to the increased global traffic and actions of humans. So not only does Darwin show that the interrelations of the confined ecological system have changed, but also that due to the mouse's transformation to sort of a quasi-indigenous or independent species, that there is an ongoing change in organic production in which species migration plays a pivotal role. So the singular encounters and movements within the constructed and confined environment can change the first perceived aspect of it. And this really underlines the problem of creating environmental boundaries in the first place. They are susceptible to change. So before Humboldt crosses the mountainous borders from Lake Tagarigua in the next chapter, going into the South American savanna, he interlinks the two areas through a natural phenomenon that's found in both places, the hydrogen sulfide gas, which was first found at the hot springs of La Trinchera. And he does not really answer why it is present in these two highly different environments, but he sort of open-mindedly questions the patterns of similarity, and he in fact encourages others to search for the answers, other naturalists. So he opens the chapter for revision made by other naturalists. And I think very much this is mirrored by the fact that the chapter does not have a dramatic end. He only leaves the region in the following chapter. And as the scientific knowledge of the sulfide gas, then the reader must remain flexible and open for a revision of his view of the region that's just been portrayed. And this openness to revision of past images of the region is necessary for the reader to understand the consequences of the ongoing ecological changes in the Aragua Valleys, maybe even beyond its borders. So at the epistemological and the geographic center of the chapter, which was the island on the lake, Humboldt sort of amends the image of his first environmental borders of the region. So he writes, the view of the lake and of the richly cultivated neighboring valleys is admirable, particularly after sunset, when thousands of aquatic birds, herons, flamingos, and wild ducks cross the lake to roost in the islands. And the broad zone of mountains that surround the horizon is covered with fire. The inhabitants, as we've already mentioned, burn the meadows in order to produce fresher and finer grass. Gramineous plants abound, especially at the summit of the chain, and those vast conflagrations extend sometimes over a length of 1,000 toises and appear like streams of lava overflowing the ridge of the mountains. When reposing on the banks of the lake in one of those beautiful evenings peculiar to the tropics to enjoy the soft freshness of the air, it is delightful to contemplate in the waves that beat the shore of the image of the red fires that inflame the horizon. And if we compare it to the first borders or the first frame that's made of the region, this image is no longer static, but instead very much indicates movement and transition. So the day changes to night, the birds fly over the lake, and the human inhabitants, they burn the meadows over the horizon. I think there's also an eeriness to the scene because the naturalist reflects on the red fires that are mirrored in the waves, feeding to the center picture and the center argument, which is the island or it's on the island. And so the fire within this image moves far over the mountain ridges and thus the narrative frame of the chapter, forcing an ecological change in the environment and beyond. And like Humboldt's personal interlinkage of natural phenomena across borders, the ecological changes themselves cross the environmental borders, basically relativizing the boundaries first constructed and emphasizing a transregional consequence of human presence, traffic, and natural resources. And it is something that he continuously emphasizes throughout the chapter as well. So an openness to revision of the previously constructed environmental borders is also visible in Darwin's portrayal of the Galápagos. So he corrects his first metaphor of the Galápagos being a satellite to America to instead be satellites to America. So basically, he's correcting his metaphor to be in plural instead. So he really opens the notion that a naturalist can study the interrelatedness of environmental elements spanning from the local, which is represented by the individual islands, to the regional, which is represented by the archipelago, and then finally to the greater planetary spheres, which is represented by the South American continent that the archipelago is linked to. So a flexibility for changes in our imagination of what makes out a natural environment is needed by the reader. So like Humboldt, this openness is mirrored at the end of the Galapagos chapter. So Charles Darwin does not describe his farewell to the Galapagos, but ends it on a type of speculative high point that's resulting from the natural history that's given to the island group. So being turned very much towards that which lies ahead, this section, as I said, begins in the future tense. And Darwin writes in his very last sentences of the chapter that in regards to the wildness of birds towards man, there's no way of accounting for it except as an inherited habit. Comparatively few young birds in any one year have been injured by man in England, yet almost all, even nestlings, are afraid of him. Many individuals, on the other hand, both at the Galapagos and at the Falklands, have been pursued and injured by man. But yet have not learned a salutary dread of him. We may infer from these facts what havoc the introduction of any new beast of prey must cause in a country before the instincts of the indigenous inhabitants have become adapted to the stranger's craft or power. So through characterization of the organisms on the Galapagos and a transcontinental comparison of organisms' habits in England and the Falklands, the reader is invited to take an open-minded leap in imagining extinction of those creatures that are failing to adapt swiftly to human presence. So the human movement, represented by Darwin, as well as of human settlers, could be said to be both catalyzers, but also exposers of ecological change. And if we consider this archipelagic portrayal as a distinct but always interrelated environment, the narrative is, like Darwin's journey itself, directed towards other world environments, many of which we know are currently undergoing similar processes of extinction. So by bridging gaps of history to the present and the future, Darwin's chapter reveals world environments in anything but stasis. Their histories and futures are both bound by migration. So Darwin, he really sees the same pattern of ecological change caused by global infrastructure and the developments of humanity. Yeah. And these are my cited works. Of course, in my thesis, there are a lot more, but these are the ones that are from the presentation. And I sort of chose to stop here because, yeah, if you have more questions, also to do with my thesis, you're very welcome to ask them. But this is it.